is to really think about where is sometimes that resistance to change coming from. And broadly speaking, there's kind of like three different areas and that resistance comes from. The first one is
welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast. I'm your host, Abby White. Today, we're revisiting a conversation we had with Phil Cleary from Salesforce. Now, Phil joined us for a webinar series we were having around the Sales Crossroads. And we had such a fantastic conversation around how do you actually create a step change in sales team behavior? How do you actually move teams from reactive to proactive? How do you actually go about creating a sales transformation? It's all well and good us saying we want to do it, providing enablement, upskilling, but how do you actually make the rubber hit the road, proof in the pudding, and make it actually happen and come to fruition? So Phil has an extensive background in sales enablement and in sales roles himself, with the majority of his time being spent at Salesforce. His role now currently is Sales Leader Excellence Coach, and prior to that, he was Head of Sales Enablement Delivery for APAC for Salesforce. And so Phil has so much experience to be able to bring to this conversation. So we wanted to take an extract from our webinar conversation and share it with you, so all of our lovely listeners also get to learn from Phil's pearls of wisdom. So grab your coffee, sit back, enjoy, and check out this conversation with Phil. Welcome back.
good to be back.
So I want to start with, we've talked about some of the disruption that we're seeing. We've talked about what Alana's seeing at LinkedIn. I want to just get your lens on this before we go into behaviors. What is sort of some of the sales disruption, some of the sales changes that you're seeing from your view of the world?
Yeah, look, I think there's all the typical ones we see happening that you can almost predict as well. There's always these technological advancements happening. Are we keeping up with the latest technology? Are people using it? Are we also keeping up with the fact that our customers have new technology as well, and that they're using that in different ways that might impact on how we buy? And so technology is one of those things. I think there's always a change in the competitive environment for people as well. If you think about those concentric circles of competitive differentiation, your product at the middle, your ability to maintain your price, your quality, but also your sales and marketing capability as well. And so when I talk about the competitive landscape, it's like, is our product competitive, number one? Is it competitive in the industry and the part of the world that we're selling it in? Is it competitive in the segment, like the business size we're selling to as well? But are my salespeople and my marketing and all those initiatives, are they competitive as well? And that's one of those biggest things that we see is when you have people that are they might leave your organization or join your organization, and you're learning more about how other organizations do things. And you kind of get a good sense of like, what's the sales and marketing capability like out there in the market as well. I think it's a really valid thing to be thinking about, because that's always changing and you need to evolve as well and make sure that your capability improves. Kind of goes with the technology thing. I think remote selling is the big thing now. So yes, it's always preferable to get face to face with somebody and do something in real life. But like, we all have to be really good at remote selling now. We have to be good at how we do our research, how we approach, how we get FaceTime, how we execute that, that valuable time as well. We always talk about, when you're engaging with executives, how to best do that, be brief, be brilliant, be gone. How do you do that in a virtual environment, in as effective a way as well? And then a bit to what, you talked about with LinkedIn previously as well, is this idea of like building deep relationships, using data, using platforms like Sales Navigator. We're big fans of that as well. To be able to build those relationships, to get really good at social selling, or at least helping people understand, helping potential buyers understand why I might buy from you, an organization, rather than why I might hire you. And that's one of those things I think a lot of us, the trap we often fall into is we think it's the shop window for another company to come and hire me. And maybe you might be in that particular stage of your career, and you absolutely want to position yourself like that. But most of the time, what you really want to do is position yourself as somebody who's trustable, who's credible, who's experienced, who's a safe pair of hands, who's low risk, who understands my industry and my company, has done what I'm trying to do before. And so to get that sense from you instead, as opposed to, I did 180% of my quota last year. I don't care about that as much if I'm a buyer than, that I help my customers increase their revenue by 180% last year. That's much more what I'm keen on. So I think there's all of those, but I think there's what's changing with the customer. as well, and the constraints that customers are experiencing right now. And one of the most interesting aspects of that is I'm a big fan of the Challenger Sale, and the book written by Brent Adamson and Matt Dixon. And Matt recently, about a year and a half ago, brought out another book called JOLT. And JOLT is all about overcoming customer inertia, or the fact that instead of them, instead of them not buying because we haven't done a good enough selling job, it's that they're not buying because they're too afraid to act and make a mistake. And so this whole idea of there's two different, the traditional, particularly at high tech where we're selling, particularly software, and again, particularly subscription software in a SaaS environment. There was always that classic playbook, which was, let me paint a picture of the future for you. Let me tell you all about the proof points. I'll do a business case. Here's my customer of mine has had this success trying to do what you're trying to do. I'm painting a favorable future, and I'm telling you that you might increase your pipeline, your win rates, your deal size, your partner engagement rates, your customer renewals. I can help you increase all those things. And here's the proof. And why wouldn't you invest and buy from me, and miss out on that? And so there's this traditional model of FOMO, fear of missing out, FOMO, but then this new model as well, where customers are finding themselves, particularly, over the last, 18 months, 2 years or so, a lot of companies are doing layoffs. People, roles aren't as secure. People are afraid of making mistakes and particularly bad investments on the company's behalf as well. And so what that might look like is, I don't want to go and spend 10 grand or 100 grand or $1 million on this technology, and it might be Salesforce or CRM or anything else. I don't want to do that if there's a risk that I might make a mistake, that I'm not, capable or good enough to implement it and make it successful, that I can't drive that adaptive behavioral change. And if I can't do that, and I get dragged in front of the COO or the CTO or the CEO, I have to explain that, I spent this much of their budget and we've had no real, quantifiable return on it, I don't want to get fired. So the status quo is more preferable to me than it is to go and do something about it. And that's the other, playbook that we now have to deploy as salespeople, is how do we help jolt the customer out of this inertia that they're in? And so I encourage everybody to go and research and pick up a copy of the Matt Dixon book, JOLT. But it talks in detail. It's this 4-letter acronym, JOLT, all about how you assess really the levels of doubt and uncertainty that they have. That you limit their exploration, and that you stop them over analyzing, that you offer your recommendations to them, and you use your experience to say, well, in your situation, I don't think you want to go all in. I think you want to, start with this product in this department, solving this problem first. And then also taking risk off the table for them as well, and making it a much easier option for them to go through, with sometimes get out clauses, with proof of concepts, with, much deeper demos, etc. So that you can really make them feel much more secure about it. And so that's, I think, some of the biggest changes we're seeing in the market now, that sellers have to adapt to and do things differently if they want to overcome the challenges.
Yeah, I saw a study on this because clearly, I love my stats and studies. I do actually do any other things other than reading stats, just to, clarify for everyone. I got told I was the crazy book lady the other day. But I saw this study that was 2.5 million sales transactions were reviewed, and some of them were complex, some of them were simple. And the biggest risk to it not going ahead, the deal not going ahead, wasn't the competition and losing to the competition. It was like you just said, it was indecision and stay with the status quo because I don't want to make a bad mistake. So I want to change us then to this embracing change. We're all about adaptive behaviours today. So if we're sort of sitting here going, okay, I know that my sellers need to embrace deep sales. They need to embrace, some of the using the new tools that are available. I paid for those LinkedIn licenses or the Salesforce license and they're not using it. And there's this level of what we've talked about in this context, change being a step change from what I've always done. How do we start that journey of embracing change?
I think one of the things you have to think deeply about is why there might be resistance to that change. So we all, as professionals, as salespeople, as human beings, we know that change is inevitable. We know it's always going to come. There's always that classic change curve. And if you look at it, there's lots of research done on this, and it's been adapted from the traditional Kubler-Ross grief curve. And so where there's denial and depression and acceptance and kind of moving on, it's the same thing that people go through when they're learning how to deal with change. And it could be change, if we go back to your transformation model, change in strategy, change in, how we're going to sell our products and how we're going to market and who gets paid on them, and change in my comp plan, change in my territory, change in, the products that I'll focus on, changing who's supporting me and what my virtual team is, changing the partners I have to support me. And so I know those things are going to happen all the time, but as leaders, and this is where I spend a lot of my time, is coaching leaders and how do they engage with their teams and help them to embrace and move forward that change. One of the key ways is for the leader to be kind of like a phase ahead of their teams in that change curve. Because the leaders, guess what? They also at some point have to learn about these changes that are happening, and they have to be ahead of their team, a phase ahead, which is why often it does make sense in organizations that we can't just go full transparency, everybody knows everything at the same time. We need to drip feed some of those changes so that there's understanding that level ahead or the hierarchy of the salespeople, so that the leaders are kind of like, they're more adjusted to it. And they've gone through the denial and the depression and the frustration and but they've gone through the experimentation, and they're coming through into like it becoming a habit for them as well. So they've gone through that and they kind of understand the change. That's the first thing, is make sure your leaders have gone through that change and they're a step ahead in the first place. The second thing is to really think about where is sometimes that resistance to change coming from. And broadly speaking, there's kind of like three different areas that resistance comes from. The first one is, I don't understand the change. Why are we making this change? It doesn't make any sense. Things were great the way they were before. I don't know why this is happening. And so as a leader, you have to be super curious. You have to be educational. You have to sometimes come with data. You have to show them the pattern or what the data showed that instituted this particular change. You have to take their concerns on board. And sometimes it's a little bit about just helping them to understand what's going on. The second type of resistance is much more emotional, and it's that they might go, I understand the change, but I don't like it. It doesn't suit me. Comp plan doesn't suit me anymore. Not having the same territory doesn't suit me anymore. Having to change my forecasting process doesn't suit me anymore. You expect me to do, 2 hours extra prospecting every week doesn't suit me. I don't like doing that. So much before, prefer to bring my customers to the pub instead. And that's a better way for me to generate sales. Or is what they would say. And so how do we engage with that? And so quite often that shows up. They don't often say, I don't like it. What they'll actually do is they'll pretend they just don't understand it. And they'll ask questions that, if they try to clarify the processes. So you really have to be very sort of careful and ask questions, be curious as a leader, but be very empathetic and understand, yes, this change means something for the organization that we expect will improve things. You're clearly concerned that it'll have a negative impact on you. Tell me more about that. What's that negative impact for you? What's the basis for the belief on that? And really help them to articulate what their key concerns are, much more from an individual and an emotional perspective in the first place. And so talking about it, understanding, being curious, sharing, and bringing them on the journey is really key around that second part, which is that, I don't like the change. The third part around resistance to change. So the first one was that intellectual, I don't understand. Number two, the emotional, I don't like it. And then the third one is much more about that they instead of it, they understand the change, they're okay with it from a personal perspective, but sometimes they don't like you as the change maker. And whatever I can do to get in your way, to make things difficult, to make you less successful. So there's some sort of relationship dynamic happening there around that resistance to change as well. And so how do you start dealing with that? Well, you have to recognize that it's happened. Sometimes you have to put your hands up and go, mea culpa. I know that we've had sort of a disagreement in the past. We haven't always seen eye to eye. Here's my perspective on that and where that's going to come from. Sometimes you have to, again, just hold your hands up and apologize for things. You have to over communicate all the time. And you need to make sure that you're kind of fixing the relationship and you're reestablishing trust, most importantly, to then overcome the resistance to change. And so that trust aspect is really key as well. I can talk for days and at length about building trust. My favorite book on that is David Maister's The Trust Equation. Again, recommend, I'll type that into the chat as well, but the Trusted Advisor, in fact, inside the Trusted Advisors is a piece called the Trust Equation, which is awesome. And it's really all about, bringing credibility, bringing reliability, bringing intimacy to relationship, and minimizing your self orientation. And so if you can do all those things with your sales teams, you build that trust. It helps you to overcome that resistance to change as well.
Now, letting you in on a little bit of a secret, we are gearing up to open our doors for RevUp 2025 program. We've got new masterclasses, we've got some new speakers who are being added to the lineup. So if you want to be the first to know about it, then go into the show notes, follow the link and put down join waitlist, and you'll be the first person to hear about it and also get our early bird promo offer. I want to talk about as well, like how do you make it sticky? So you talked before about now today where your role in Salesforce, a lot of the time you're working with sales leaders and coaching those sales leaders, and they're trying to embed that change and make it stick. Because I find that a lot of leaders we talk to go, we've done the enablement, we've got the comp plan sorted, those first parts of that sort of our 7-step process, yet we've got that tick, 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 but it's still not happening. Or there's that initial resistance that's like, oh, this doesn't work. Nah, this isn't for us, not for our company, or not for my territory. So how do you sort of try and deal with some of those resistance factors and then that stickiness to really create the lasting change, and not just we all went on the crash diet, we lost a few kilos, but then we put it back on and went back to old habits?
I think a lot of it comes down to tracking. You talked about that a lot before, tracking those leading indicators, and are we doing the things that will lead to those lagging indicators that we want to see? So is the level of prospecting and the hours spent on the number of phone calls being made, is that therefore resulting in an increase in pipeline and therefore revenue for me and my win rates? And so, being able to link those two things and tracking that. Accountability, I think it's really difficult. And this is one of the things, again, I talk to sales leaders about a lot, is what are the things that they're accountable for, but they're not holding their team accountable for. And this can come around in things like where the leader's carrying all the risk around pipeline and forecasting accuracy and adherence to a sales methodology. And so we're training the salespeople to do something. How do we drive the behavior and get them to do it? The sales leader themselves needs to be held accountable to it by their second line sales leader, so that we can understand and know whether those things are happening on a weekly, on a monthly, on a quarterly basis as well. So are the activities that we're asking to do, are they actually happening? And a great way to think about this is one of my favorite models or kind of frameworks that I tend to use in coaching conversations are very simple quadrants. There's like a y-axis and an x-axis. The y-axis, like from bottom to top, is are our salespeople doing all the right things? The things that we know that will make salespeople successful. Are they taking their training? I would be a big advocate of that, obviously. Are they coming into the office? Are they forecasting, accurately on a regular basis? Are they calling their customers? Are they getting on the road? Are they doing their certifications? All the things we want them to be able to do, and that makes it kind of like a sort of a good sales corporate citizen. On the y-axis, on the x-axis, left to right, is getting it done. Are they being successful with those lagging indicators? Is it generating, revenue for them? And we have a metric inside of Salesforce that we call participation split by productivity. But are those lagging indicators, going in the right direction as well? And so if we can then look at those different quadrants in that grid, those individuals that are at the top right-hand corner, they're doing it right and they're getting it done. They're great examples to then showcase and to follow and to give extra responsibility to, whether it's by being like team leaders, or that they're speaking on calls, or if they're the folks that are appearing on your internal training courses, etc. They're kind of like the best practice, and they get to share how to do things. And so you're exalting like the desire for people to be seen as almost like this A player. Sometimes you get those B players, they're doing the right things, but they're not actually executing that well. And that goes back to what I said about the quality. If they could be doing the things, they could be making 20 cold calls every single day. If those cold calls are not very good, if they're not well researched, if there's no context, if the person receiving the call doesn't really understand why they've been called, if they're really bad calls, they're not going to move themselves into that top right-hand quadrant, into the A players. It's the job of the sales leader to help them to be better, to coach them, to drive the quality of their calls. You can certainly have people in the bottom left who are not doing the right things and not getting it done. Dangerous place to be in any sales organization, because that either leads to you leaving the organization getting managed out, or your option is to start doing the right things so that you can then move across into getting it done. And then, of course, we all know people that are in the bottom right-hand corner. They still get the number done. They still hit quota. They still do the target. And they look really good on paper, but they don't exude all those behaviors that we want to see. They don't come into the office. They will, load the risk onto the manager and the forecast. They bring in bluebirds all the time, or they sandbag on the pipeline. There's all these different surprises you didn't expect. They don't do their certifications. They don't attend training. They're not helpful to their leader. But we're all addicted to those salespeople because guess what? They bring in like 70, 80% of our revenue. I'm afraid to not have that person and have to like abide by that behavior. Problem with that person is, number one, it's toxic behavior that everybody else in the team sees. And that if they try to adopt, if I behave like that person, I'll be successful. Probably not. And that's the issue, right? So that you can't adopt those toxic behaviors. Number one. Number two, you're only as good as your last month, your last quarter. And so if you're like that bottom right, you're getting the number done, but you're not doing all the right things. The moment you don't do your number, no one's going to save you, right? And you're sort of like, you're in a bad spot if you're suddenly not doing the right things and you're not getting it done. And so I love to think about like helping your salespeople picture themselves in each different part of the quadrant. I wouldn't necessarily do a whiteboard in a team meeting and say, Tom is in this quadrant and Sarah is in this quadrant. That's very dangerous. But I would encourage folks to like to use it as a model, to think about where my team sits in the different quadrants, and for them to see that as well, to think about where they might sit there. And that helps to then drive these behaviors that stick because they want to do the right things in order to get it done.
I love that. I love that. So good. I can relate to so many of those examples and stories. The only thing I'd sort of add is something that I've found useful as well is also that role modeling and leading from the front. Whenever we do enablement, when the sales leaders, or we've had some where the managing director will turn up and sit in the enablement, like, I'm not too good to not be here and to learn. And that level of, I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do. And that leading from the front, in our team meeting, all of us have to do our one thing a week that goes towards our wildly important goal. Don't give a monkeys what your role is. No one's too good for it. So I think there's also that I've personally found helps. And I think we see better outcomes when we're seeing the leaders jumping on board, getting stuck in, that. I don't know whether you see that, but that's something I definitely have noticed.
What I really love about that, is my response to that. What I love about it is like they're almost endorsing it. Like I remember, growing up, if I bought like a tennis racket and I said Andre Agassi on it, my twin, I was like, I want to buy that racket because he endorses it, right? And so by a sales leader, and particularly the more senior the sales leader, getting involved and being part of that training and almost like, putting their signature against it and endorsing it, I think really is important in terms of driving that. The second thing is they also take away the languages and the models and the frameworks that are used. And so they can then start like reliably talking about, let's imagine, you rolled out something like a Sandler. And so they start using the language like an upfront contract or a pain gain funnel or, a reward reverse or whatever it is. And so they're using the language as well in the organization. And therefore that starts being an important aspect to driving that kind of like the adoption of it as well. So because if my senior leader is using this framework and using that language, I need to do the same thing as well.
I need to jump on board. Cool. Time has run away with us. I honestly thought I had done it differently this time. We were going to have so much more time. So I'm sorry if we haven't got to all of the questions. Phil, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing pearls of wisdom. I hope you enjoyed that podcast conversation with Phil. If you want to connect with Phil, check out the show notes. All the contact details are there. Also within the show notes are other ways that you can get your hands on more educational resources. If you missed the memo, we have been digging deep and building YouTube content, so you can join us on our YouTube channel there. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, we're also gearing up to open our doors for Rev Up 2025 program with new speakers, new masterclasses that are being added onto the lineup. And so if you want to be the first to hear about it and get your early bird promo, then join following the link in the show notes.